much for joining us, everyone. Today, we're really lucky to have Joseph Robertson, CCE's Global Strategy Director, with us to share his conference plenary. Joe does policy analysis, coordinates strategy to train and empower volunteers, and develops our new groups on all 5 continents. Joe leads CCE's engagement with the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, and other multinational and multilateral institutions. Joe also leads the Citizens Climate Education Network, or Engagement Network rather, and is the lead strategist supporting the high-level climate dialogue series, Accelerating Progress, Advancing Innovation. Thanks so much for joining us today, Joe, and I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you, Brett. I'm just going to share some slides and some information about our development of new groups around the world. In the role of Global Strategy Director, it's necessary to try to translate Citizens Climate Lobby's citizen engagement work into a lot of different political contexts. And I'd say the number one thing that we learn is that everybody feels they have the same kind of obstacles, that those obstacles are unique. And it turns out that the way that CCL does things actually applies pretty universally to a lot of different places. In 2014, the end of 2014, we had new groups just getting started in Sweden and in Bangladesh. So I'm going to start with Europe and share how we've developed since then. Lars Almström, who's our national coordinator in Sweden, said, when you have grandkids, you see that you must work on this. We have no choice but to do this work to leave them a good future. And he and his Grand Panthers movement that have turned into CCL Sweden have been just unbelievable. They're publishing letters to the editor, they're meeting with Parliament, and they've been a great example of taking CCL's methodology to other places around the world. And since Sweden got going, we've seen expansion all across Europe, as you can see. And are now just starting to explore the possibility of a group in Ukraine, and since we put this together, Ireland also. Those volunteers are doing local group organizing, they're doing media work, they're meeting with members of Parliament. Here you see CCL Germany in front of the Bundestag. The slides are moving a little slowly. Here you see CCLers supporting a rally and also recruiting new volunteers, promoting carbon fee and dividend. This is the Have Your Cake and Eat It Too campaign that CCL UK started, where they actually took cake to members of Parliament to explain that carbon fee and dividend gives you the best of both worlds, a better economy and a better climate. In the Pacific, we started to get engagement in Australia, and Rod Mitchell, who's turned into an incredible leader for CCL, said this recently: we are offering hope and inspiration in the first and only country to abolish a functioning carbon price. And we do this with a strong sense of being part of a global movement. Australia passed a carbon pricing policy years ago, and then a government came in to try to get rid of it. And all over the political spectrum there, you've got politicians kind of ripping their own people apart over carbon pricing. And now, because of CCL's strong work, the government is starting to move back in that direction. And for Rod and his volunteers there, they've been really, really proud to be part of the overall CCL movement around the world. You see New Zealand also, we have volunteers there, and we're just starting to get some people in the Philippines getting involved. This is the end of the training of our first national conference in Australia. Everybody was together essentially in a big sort of communal act of gratitude. This is CCL Australia on Parliament Hill, and they've now had 3 national conferences and 4 lobby days. And they're continuing to do the hard work of making sure they talk to everybody and listen and build political will. In Asia, our engagement got started there in Bangladesh, but our local leader in Bangladesh and our local leader in Nepal, Aryanu Preti, quickly found they had some shared experiences of vulnerability. Nepal, which is the world's highest country, and Bangladesh, the world's lowest lying country, are both vulnerable to climate change due to ice melt and runoff and rising sea levels in different parts of that water cycle. And Aryan tells a story of how every Saturday for 200 weeks, people in the capital of Kathmandu come together to keep the river clean. And that kind of active citizenship is part of what they're now trying to translate into policy engagement. You see here Bangladesh, Nepal, Qatar, and then India as well. India is going through a kind of second startup phase with CCL under new leadership from Raj Pukant. Here's CCL Nepal actually going to do relief work in the wake of the terrible earthquake that happened there. They weren't doing it because it's climate work, they were doing it because it's citizenship and it's necessary. But the earthquake impacts in Nepal and the landslides are climate impacts because the glaciers are pulling the mountains apart, making everything much less stable. This is Raj, who's now leading CCL India, and here's Nishad, who's our special liaison to the Gulf Cooperation Council, working on developing a kind of CCL presence in oil-rich countries in the Middle East. In Latin America, we have seen some incredible inspired leadership, especially in CCL Panama has just been incredibly active, getting people engaged directly with government ministers. And Kale Venderman said, abrimos una puerta que esperamos sea muy útil para lograr cosas en este país. Me sentí emocionada, feliz, me sentí un miembro activo de mi sociedad. And that translates to, we opened a door that we hope will be very useful for achieving things in this country. I felt excited, happy. I felt like I was an active member of my society. And that kind of engagement has been inspiring on both sides, to the citizens and also to the people in government, hearing from people. The experience of talking to constituents has been really inspiring for them. And you see that just before the CCL conference, we began to get a new group started in Colombia. So quickly expanding across the region. This is CCL Panama. We have calls in Spanish. There's a WhatsApp group helping organize. Tammy and Isatis are co-coordinating the region. And you just see this inspired opportunity, people really recognizing they can play a role in driving better policy, and really positive response from governments that like hearing from people. Africa has been an amazing story. At the beginning of 2016, we had no active local chapters in Africa. We now have active local chapters in 12 countries. Abiola, who had a terrible experience with people really violently opposed to any kind of local environmental cleanup or activism, said, I realized that the anger felt by these people about my environmental advocacy was not about me or my advocacy. It was about how deeply disempowered they feel. And he recognized that the message he was receiving, which seemed like such a negative message, was a cry for help, and that CCL was an opportunity to empower people and to take away that disempowerment and help them create a better future for themselves, their city, their country, and for the continent. And that's the kind of leadership that David Michael Terangwa, our Africa coordinator, has brought to the work. This knowledge that people really can take back the future. And what you don't see here is that also just before the CCL conference, Mali, there's a group in Bamako that has started. So really a region that has a lot of development to do and can do it in the cleanest possible way, just kind of coming on. Here's CCL volunteers in Cote d'Ivoire celebrating Earth Day. Here's David Michael Terangwa talking to people in the community, telling the story of climate science and then solutions. Here's a CCL group started up under Sister Lillian Chibiko in Nigeria. And all across the continent, we've seen people coming together to not only work as citizen volunteers, but also to invite policymakers into town hall meetings. If government isn't hosting those meetings, citizens are going to host those meetings. And it's been a really inspirational process watching CCL Africa grow. So to talk for a minute about the Paris Agreement. You know, our Pathway to Paris project was also part of our global strategy to ramp up our own engagement as CCL around the world, to give people around the world an opportunity to connect with the global process. What some refer to as supranational democracy, citizens interacting with the intergovernmental policy arena, is not all that well developed a process. The intergovernmental space is mainly for governments. And so bringing people into it was one of the goals of our Pathway to Paris project. We were involved in the crafting of some of the Paris Agreement. You see some of our people at the table with the co-chairs of the working group that oversaw the drafting of the agreement there. We know that fee and dividend is a way that we can solve climate change without all of the other regulatory mechanisms that some people want. But we also know that the Paris Agreement gives a very highly efficient policy resource to direct investment to make sure that the world is moving in the right direction. The slides are kind of going slowly right now, so while they catch up, I'll just keep talking. We decided that we would put out parisprogress.org, a simple index that just takes you through some of the platforms that are helping to implement the Paris Agreement. You see there our Citizens Climate Engagement Network. You also see in the center of the screen there a meeting of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. This is what's called the NASCA portal, the Non-State Actors Zone for Climate Action. And these represent registered climate actions to reduce emissions and build a clean economy all over the world. And you can see whether it's short-term pollutants, transportation, renewable energy, or emissions reduction, there are thousands upon thousands of actions being taken by non-state actors. So it's not just national governments that are responsible for implementing the Paris Agreement. And a piece of good news that maybe people need to hear is that the United States is implementing the Paris Agreement. Whether the federal government is on board or not, 85% of Americans live in towns and cities that are already working to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, and they may go beyond what the United States committed under the previous administration. So it's not all a bad story relating to the Paris Agreement. And here you see CCL's growth around the world. We want to bring as many people around the world into direct contact with their leaders as possible. And so the one place we don't have volunteers is Antarctica, but Isatis, our co-coordinator for Latin America, did go there last year. So we wanted to make sure everybody had a chance to see that. We did get to Antarctica as well. And ultimately, I think one of the things that is really motivating this growth of CCL around the world was said by Namake Wong from CCL in Latin America, who said, "El clima necesita el mejor de nosotros," which translates roughly as the climate needs the very best we have to give. And that's the spirit that people are coming together around, just like they are in the original CCL groups. Basically saying, we know it's hard. We know that there are all kinds of political reasons people may stand against doing the best possible thing, but doing the best possible thing is something we have a right to ask for. And if it's hard, that's probably a good reason to go and try to do it. And then here you can see what we call our IRC group, our International Regional Coordinating Group, which includes our regional coordinators for Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and the Pacific, along with Raj, our India National Coordinator, which is an enormous task in itself, and Nishad, our Gulf Cooperation Council liaison. So that's the state of CCL around the world, and we're looking forward to a lot more in the new year.